The galaxy had long known fear, but never like this. The Voidborn ascendancy was not merely an empire, it was a force of nature, a tide of destruction that swept across the stars, devouring everything in its path. Their ships were abominations, neither fully machine nor fully alive. Vast and grotesque, they moved like predators, their surfaces rippling with veins of dark energy that pulsed like the heartbeat of some monstrous entity. To gaze upon them was to feel a primal dread, as though the very fabric of reality recoiled from their presence. For centuries, the Voidborn had been unstoppable. Entire civilizations had been reduced to whispers, their histories erased, their worlds left barren. The stars they touched grew dimmer, as if the light itself fled from their approach. They were more than conquerors, they were annihilators, leaving behind only ruin and despair. And now, their shadow fell upon Dawnspear. Dawnspear was a jewel among the stars, a world of breathtaking beauty and tranquility. Its surface shimmered with crystalline cities that rose like delicate sculptures from the verdant forests and sparkling lakes. The Ilari, the planet's inhabitants, were a peaceful race, their lives intertwined with the natural harmony of their world. Their forms were elegant, their translucent skin refracting light in soft hues of blue and green, as if they were living prisms. But the Voidborn cared nothing for beauty or harmony. The invasion began without warning. The skies above Dawnspear turned black, the sun swallowed by the grotesque forms of the Voidborn vessels. Their ships hung in the heavens like carrion birds, their surfaces writhing as if alive. From their underbellies, they unleashed swarms of drones, horrific, insect-like constructs that buzzed with a mechanical hum. Each was a nightmare of serrated limbs and glowing red eyes, designed with one purpose: destruction. The Ilari, unprepared for war, could do little to resist. Their crystalline cities shattered under the relentless assault, the once brilliant spires collapsing into glittering rubble. The swarms moved with merciless efficiency, tearing through defenses and leaving no survivors in their wake. The air was filled with the sound of destruction, the crackling of energy weapons, the shrieks of the dying, and the unrelenting hum of the Voidborn machines. In the midst of the chaos, the Ilari made a desperate attempt to reach out to the stars. From the ruins of one of their grand cities, a transmission was sent, a plea for help. The message carried the voices of the Ilari elders, their words trembling with fear and sorrow. To whoever may hear this, they said, "We are the Ilari of Dawnspear. Our world is under attack. We beg for aid. Please, if there is anyone out there, help us." But even as the message was sent, the Ilari knew the truth. No one would come. The Voidborn had crushed every force that had dared to oppose them. Entire fleets had been obliterated, entire worlds silenced. The galaxy had learned to fear them, and in that fear, it had grown silent. To stand against the Voidborn was to invite annihilation. Far away, on the edge of known space, the last human warship drifted in the void. The Starforge was a relic of humanity's past, a battered vessel that had survived countless battles. Its hull bore the scars of decades of war, yet it still carried the spirit of its crew, a stubborn refusal to surrender, even in the face of overwhelming odds. On the bridge of the Starforge, Captain Arlen Voss stood in silence as the Ilari's plea played over the ship's COMM system. Voss was a man forged by war, his face lined with the weight of countless decisions, his eyes sharp and unyielding. He listened to the message, his jaw tightening with each word. Around him, his officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard such pleas before, and they knew how it always ended. The Voidborn were unstoppable. To answer the call was to invite death. One of his officers, a young woman named Lieutenant Matarak, broke the silence. "Captain," she said hesitantly, "we can't fight them. Not with just this ship. The Council will never approve." Voss's gaze remained fixed on the display, where the image of dawn spires burning cities flickered. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he turned to face his crew, his voice calm but resolute. "The Council doesn't decide who we are," he said. "We do." The room fell silent. Voss stepped forward, his voice gaining strength. "The galaxy has forgotten what it means to be human. They think we're broken, scattered, finished. But they're wrong. We fight not because we're strong, but because we refuse to let tyranny extinguish the last lights of hope." He looked at each of his officers in turn, his gaze steady. "The Ilari need us. And if we don't stand for them, who will?" The crew exchanged uncertain looks, but one by one, they nodded. They had followed Voss through countless battles, and they trusted him with their lives. "Prepare the ship," Voss ordered. "We're going to Dawnspire." As the Starforge powered up its engines, the crew worked with a sense of purpose. They knew the odds were against them. They knew the Voidborn were stronger, faster, and more numerous. But they also knew that if they did nothing, the Ilari would be lost. And so, against all logic, against all fear, humanity answered the call. The Starforge vanished into the void, a lone spark of defiance in a galaxy consumed by darkness. The Starforge drifted in the cold, endless void, a shadow of humanity's once mighty fleet. Its hull, scarred and battered by decades of relentless war, told the story of a species that had fought fiercely but paid a terrible price. The ship was massive, a relic of a bygone era when humanity had dared to challenge the stars. Now, it was old and weary, much like the people who called it home. Inside, the corridors of the Starforge were dimly lit, the flickering lights casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The air carried the faint hum of machinery, a constant reminder of the ship's age and the fragility of its systems. The crew moved through the halls with quiet determination, their faces lined with exhaustion and the weight of survival. They were all that remained of humanity's fighting spirit, a skeleton crew aboard a ship that had seen better days. Humanity itself had been pushed to the brink. The Voidborn's relentless campaign had driven them from their home world and scattered them to the farthest edges of the galaxy. What remained of their civilization clung to life in hidden colonies and isolated outposts, always watching the skies for the shadow of their enemy. The Starforge was their last warship, their final hope in a galaxy that had all but forgotten them. In the central chamber of the ship, Captain Arlen Voss stood before his crew. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of the ship's control panels and the holographic map of the galaxy that floated in the center of the space. The faces of the crew were worn and weary, their eyes reflecting the weight of too many losses and too many battles. Voss himself was a figure of quiet intensity. His face was weathered, his gray-streaked hair a testament to the years he had spent fighting for humanity's survival. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, burned with a fire that refused to be extinguished. He stood tall, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. When he spoke, his voice was steady, carrying the gravity of their situation but also the spark of defiance that had kept them alive. "The galaxy has forgotten us," Voss began, his words cutting through the heavy silence. "They think humanity is broken, scattered, defeated." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each crew member. "But today," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "we remind them who we are. We fight not because we are strong, but because we refuse to let tyranny consume the light of hope." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the crew began to nod. They were terrified. How could they not be? They were one ship against an empire of nightmares. But Voss's words ignited something deep within them. A spark of courage. a memory of what it meant to stand and fight, even when the odds seemed impossible. In the days that followed, the Starforge came alive with purpose. Engineers worked tirelessly in the ship's bowels, their hands blackened with grease as they coaxed the ancient systems back to life. Sparks flew as they welded damaged panels, their faces illuminated by the glow of their tools. The ship groaned and shuddered under their efforts, but it held together, a stubborn relic that refused to die. The tactical team gathered in the war room, their faces grim as they pored over maps and schematics. They knew the Voidborn were stronger, faster, and more numerous. But they also knew their enemy's arrogance. The Voidborn saw humanity as a defeated species, unworthy of fear or respect. It was this overconfidence that the crew of the Starforge hoped to exploit. Voss was everywhere, his presence a constant source of strength. He moved through the ship, speaking to the crew, offering words of encouragement and quiet moments of reassurance. He knew their fears, he felt them too. But he also knew that fear could be a weapon, if wielded correctly. "We are not just fighting for the Ilari," he told them one evening, his voice echoing through the ship's intercom. "We are fighting for every world that has fallen silent. For every life that the Voidborn have stolen. For the memory of what we were, and the hope of what we can be again." The crew listened in silence, their hearts heavy but resolute. They knew the odds were against them. They knew that this mission might be their last. But they also knew that they could not stand by and do nothing. As the Starforge prepared for its journey to Dawnspire, a quiet determination settled over the ship. The crew worked with a sense of urgency, their fear tempered by the knowledge that they were humanity's last hope. Every repaired circuit, every recalibrated weapon, every moment of preparation was a step toward defiance. In the cold, vast emptiness of space, the Starforge was a single spark of light. But it was a spark that refused to be snuffed out. And as it powered up its engines and set its course for Dawnspire, the crew knew one thing for certain: they would fight. Not because they believed they could win, but because they could not bear to do nothing in the face of such darkness. For humanity, for the Ilari, for the faint hope that the galaxy might one day remember what it meant to stand against the void, they would fight. The Starforge emerged from the void like a ghost, its scarred hull catching the faint light of Dawnspire's Sunday below. The once glimmering planet lay shrouded in darkness, its skies blackened by the monstrous forms of the Voidborn fleet. Their vessels loomed above the world like predators, grotesque amalgamations of flesh and metal, their surfaces rippling with unnatural energy. Pulsating veins of dark light ran across their hulls, as though the ships themselves were alive, feeding on the fear of their prey. The moment the Starforge entered orbit, the Voidborn turned their attention to the intruder. To them, it was an insect, a remnant of a species long thought defeated, a flickering ember of a fire they had extinguished ages ago. They sent their message swiftly, a transmission that echoed through the Starforge's comms. The voice was mechanical, cold, and devoid of humanity. It carried no malice, no triumph, only the chilling certainty of a predator addressing its prey. "Surrender," the voice demanded, each syllable sharp and metallic, like the grinding of gears. "You are alone. You are insignificant. Resistance is futile." The crew of the Starforge listened in silence, their faces pale but resolute. They knew what surrender meant: obliteration, not mercy. They had seen what the Voidborn did to those who yielded. Captain Voss stood at the center of the bridge, his hands gripping the railing as the transmission played. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with defiance. He leaned forward, his voice steady and unyielding as he transmitted his response. "We do not surrender. Not to you. Not to anyone." The Voidborn offered no reply. There was no need. Their answer came moments later, as the first of their ships began to move. The lead dreadnought, a hulking monstrosity with a hull that seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the lungs of some ancient beast, turned its massive bulk toward the Starforge. Smaller ships, insect-like in design, swarmed around it, their movements erratic and unsettling, like a cloud of locusts preparing to devour their prey. Voss gave the order without hesitation. "Fire the lance." The Starforge shuddered as its prototype plasma lance came to life. The weapon, a relic of humanity's desperate attempts to fight the Voidborn during the early days of the war, had been dormant for years. Now, it roared with purpose. A beam of searing blue light erupted from the ship, cutting through the darkness of space like a blade. It struck the lead Voidborn dreadnought with unerring precision, piercing its grotesque hull. For a moment, the Voidborn ship seemed to freeze, as if stunned by the audacity of the attack. Then the beam carved deeper, slicing through its pulsating veins and triggering a violent chain reaction. The dreadnought's organic armor writhed as explosions tore through its body, bursts of sickly green fire erupting from within. The ship let out a low, guttural groan that resonated through the void, as though the vessel itself was alive and in agony. Moments later, it imploded, fragments of its twisted form scattering into the darkness. The crew of the Starforge erupted into cheers, their voices filled with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. For the first time in decades, humanity had struck a blow against the Voidborn. But their victory was short-lived. The Voidborn retaliated with fury. Their swarm ships descended upon the Starforge like a plague, their movements unnervingly coordinated. They surrounded the human vessel, their serrated limbs and glowing red eyes glinting in the dim light. The air around the Starforge seemed to hum with malevolence as energy weapons charged, their tips glowing with an unnatural crimson light. The first wave of attacks hit the Starforge like a tidal wave. The ship rocked violently, its shields flaring as they absorbed the onslaught. Sparks flew across the bridge as systems overloaded, and the crews scrambled to maintain control. The Voidborn ships moved with terrifying speed, darting in and out of the Starforge's range, their weapons tearing into its hull. But the humans fought back. The Starforge's gunners, their hands steady despite the chaos, targeted the swarm with deadly precision. Cannons roared, unleashing bursts of plasma that lit up the darkness. One by one, the Voidborn ships fell, their twisted forms disintegrating in flashes of green and red. The crew worked with desperate efficiency, their movements a dance of survival as they pushed their ship to its limits. The battle was brutal. The Starforge was battered, its hull scorched and riddled with scars. The shields flickered, on the verge of collapse, and the air inside the ship grew heavy with smoke and tension. But the humans refused to yield. They fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, their defiance a beacon in the darkness. As the Voidborn pressed their assault, something unexpected happened. The swarm ships, so confident in their superiority, began to falter. Their movements grew less coordinated, their attacks less precise. For the first time, they hesitated. The Voidborn, who had crushed countless civilizations without a second thought, were now faced with something they had never encountered before: resistance. On the bridge of the Starforge, Voss watched the enemy's hesitation with grim satisfaction. He could see it now, the faintest crack in their armor of invincibility. The Voidborn were not invulnerable. They could bleed. They could fall. "Keep firing," he ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Show them what it means to stand." The crew obeyed, their fear giving way to determination. The Starforge surged forward, its weapons blazing as it tore through the swarm. The Voidborn, caught off guard by the humans' relentless defiance, began to retreat, their ships pulling back to regroup. For a moment, the void was silent. The Starforge hung in the darkness, battered but unbroken, its crew breathing heavily as they took in the sight of the retreating enemy. They had won the first strike. They had reminded the Voidborn and the galaxy that humanity was not finished. But Voss knew the battle was far from over. The Voidborn would return, stronger and more determined than before. And when they did, the Starforge would be ready. For now, though, they had bought time for Dawnspire, for the Ilari, and for the faint, flickering hope that the darkness could still be pushed back. Above Dawnspire, the heavens burned. The battle between the Starforge and the Voidborn raged like a storm of fire and shadow, the human vessel defiant against the overwhelming swarm. Explosions lit the void, casting eerie flashes of light over the planet below, where the Ilari watched in silence. They had always believed humanity was a fading ember, a scattered remnant of a defeated race. Yet here, in the skies above their home, that ember burned brighter than they had ever imagined. In the midst of the chaos, a transmission reached the Starforge. Captain Voss stood at the command console, his face lined with exhaustion but his stance unwavering. The screen flickered, and the image of Elder Lyrian appeared. Her form shimmered like liquid crystal, her translucent skin refracting the faint light of her surroundings. She was beautiful in an alien way, her features delicate yet sharp, her eyes glowing faintly with an inner light. But her expression was heavy with sorrow, her voice a melody tinged with despair. "Why do you fight for us?" she asked, her words carrying a quiet pain. "We are strangers to you. You owe us nothing." Her question hung in the air, a reminder of the futility that had gripped so many in the face of the Voidborn. The Ilari had lived in fear for so long, retreating into isolation, believing that resistance was hopeless. Now, they watched as humanity, a species broken and scattered, fought for them with a ferocity they could not comprehend. Voss's reply was simple, but it carried the weight of every loss, every sacrifice humanity had endured. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with purpose. "We fight because it is right. Because no one deserves to face this alone." The bridge of the Starforge fell silent. Even the crew, hardened by years of war, felt the power of his words. It was not strategy or survival that drove them, it was something deeper, something that refused to be extinguished even in the darkest of times. Humanity fought not just for themselves, but for the hope that others might still rise against the Voidborn's tyranny. Elder Lyrian's crystalline form seemed to shimmer more brightly, as if Voss's words had ignited something within her. For a moment, she said nothing, her glowing eyes searching his face. Then, she bowed her head slightly, a gesture of gratitude and respect. "You are braver than we have ever been," she said softly. "Perhaps, it is time we remembered what it means to stand." The Ilari, though peaceful by nature, were not without power. Their civilization had long relied on knowledge and harmony rather than weapons, and their understanding of Dawnspire's unique energy systems was unmatched. Lyrian explained that beneath the surface of their planet lay a dormant volcanic field, ancient and vast. These volcanoes were not ordinary, they were intertwined with the planet's energy fields, capable of releasing a surge of power so immense that it could disrupt the Voidborn's organic technology. Together, the humans and the Ilari devised a plan. The Starforge would act as bait, drawing the Voidborn fleet into the volcanic region. Once the enemy was within range, the Ilari would trigger the energy surge, creating a wave of disruption that could cripple their ships. It was a dangerous gamble, the timing had to be perfect, and if the Voidborn realized the trap, they would destroy Dawnspire without hesitation. Elder Lyrian herself took charge of the operation, her melodic voice guiding the humans as they worked to integrate the Ilari's knowledge into their battle strategy. Her people, inspired by humanity's courage, emerged from their crystal cities to assist. They moved like living light, their forms glowing softly as they worked alongside the human engineers, their delicate hands manipulating controls with an elegance that seemed almost otherworldly. The volcanic field itself was a sight to behold. Deep beneath Dawnspire's surface, the dormant volcanoes glowed faintly, their magma chambers pulsating with an ethereal light. The energy fields surrounding them shimmered like a veil, their colors shifting between shades of blue and gold. The Ilari had long considered this region sacred, a place of immense power and mystery. Now, it would become their weapon. As the plan took shape, Voss found himself speaking to Lyrian once more. They stood together in the war room, the holographic map of Dawnspire's volcanic field glowing between them. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite decipher, part admiration, part sorrow, and perhaps a hint of hope. "You risk everything for us," she said quietly. "Your people, you have lost so much. How do you still find the strength to fight?" Voss's gaze was steady, his voice low and resolute. "Because if we don't fight, there will be nothing left worth saving. The Voidborn thrive on fear and despair. Every act of defiance, every spark of hope, it weakens them. And if we stand together, we can be more than just survivors. We can be something they fear." Lyrian nodded slowly, her crystalline form shimmering with a faint glow. "Then let us stand together," she said. "For Dawnspire. For humanity. For the galaxy." The alliance between the Ilari and humanity was fragile, born of desperation and shared fear. But it was also a spark of something greater, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, unity could forge a path to survival. As the Starforged prepared to lure the Voidborn into the trap, the Ilari worked tirelessly, their knowledge and precision proving invaluable. Their ancient systems, long dormant, came to life under their guidance, glowing with a radiant energy that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the planet itself. Above, the Voidborn fleet loomed like a shadow, their grotesque forms casting darkness over Dawnspire. They did not yet know what awaited them. The humans and the Ilari, two species united by courage and hope, were ready to strike. Together, they would turn the tides of the battle not with brute force, but with the power of ingenuity and the unyielding belief that even the smallest spark could pierce the void. The Starforged moved like a wounded beast, its hull scorched and fractured, trailing debris as it led the Voidborn fleet deeper into the volcanic field. The air around Dawnspire seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the planet itself held its breath. Below, the dormant volcanoes pulsed faintly, their magma chambers glowing with an eerie light, waiting for the moment they would awaken. The Voidborn followed relentlessly, their grotesque vessels closing in like predators circling their prey. The lead ships were massive, their organic forms pulsating with dark energy, veins of sickly green light running across their surfaces. The smaller swarm ships darted around them, insect-like in their movements, their serrated limbs slicing through the void as they prepared to strike. To them, the Starforged was a dying ember, a defiant but futile resistance that would soon be extinguished. But the humans and the Ilari had planned for this moment. Deep beneath the surface of Dawnspire, the Ilari worked tirelessly, their crystalline forms glowing as they activated the ancient systems that controlled the volcanic field. Elder Lyrian stood at the center of the control chamber, her shimmering figure radiating calm determination. Her hands moved gracefully over the controls, her voice melodic as she guided her people. "It is time," she said softly, her words carrying both sorrow and resolve. "Let the planet speak." The energy surge began as a faint tremor, a ripple that spread across the volcanic field like the first breath of a storm. The magma chambers pulsed brighter, their light shifting from gold to fiery red, and the air above them shimmered with plasma energy. Then, all at once, the volcanoes erupted. A storm of plasma and fire exploded into the void, engulfing the Voidborn fleet in its fury. The eruptions were not natural, they were precise, calculated, guided by the Ilari's ancient systems. Streams of molten energy shot into the sky, weaving through the enemy ships like living tendrils. The void-born vessels writhed as the plasma tore through their organic hulls, their grotesque forms shrieking with an unearthly sound. It was as if the ships themselves were alive, their agony echoing through the void. The smaller swarm ships disintegrated almost instantly, their twisted forms consumed by the plasma storm. The larger vessels fought to resist, their pulsating armor struggling to adapt to the energy surge. But the volcanic field was relentless, its fury growing with each passing moment. The Voidborn's technology, so advanced and alien, faltered against the raw power of Dawnspire's ancient defenses. One by one, the enemy ships fell, their shattered remains raining down upon the planet below. Amid the chaos, the Starforge pressed forward. Its crew worked with desperate precision, their faces pale but resolute as they navigated the storm of debris and enemy fire. Captain Voss stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the Voidborn flagship, a monstrous vessel that loomed ahead like a nightmare-given form. It was the command center of the fleet, its grotesque structure pulsating with dark energy. Veins of green light ran across its surface, converging on a central core that glowed with an ominous intensity. "Target the flagship," Voss ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "This ends now." The Starforge charged forward, its plasma lance glowing with energy. The weapon, battered but still functional, hummed with a fierce light, its power building as the crew prepared for the final strike. The flagship responded with a barrage of attacks, its weapons tearing through the void with deadly precision. Streams of crimson energy lashed out, slicing through the debris and narrowly missing the Starforge as it dodged and weaved, its movements a dance of survival. The closer they got, the more monstrous the flagship appeared. Its surface writhed as if alive, patches of organic flesh merging with jagged metal. The core at its center pulsed like a beating heart, each thrum sending waves of dark energy rippling through the void. It was a creation of pure horror, a testament to the Voidborn's unnatural power. But the humans did not falter. The Starforge pushed through the storm, its plasma lance glowing brighter with each passing second. The crew worked in silence, their focus unyielding, their determination a shield against the fear that gripped them. They knew this was their last chance. If they failed, Dawnspire would fall, and the Voidborn's reign of terror would continue. As the flagship loomed closer, Voss gave the final order. "Fire the lance." The Starforge shuddered as the weapon unleashed its fury. A beam of searing blue light erupted from the ship, cutting through the void with unerring precision. It struck the flagship's core, piercing through its pulsating armor and tearing into the heart of its dark energy. For a moment, the flagship seemed to freeze, its grotesque form trembling as the lance dug deeper. Then, the core exploded. The sky above Dawnspire lit up with a brilliant flash of light, so bright it seemed to banish the darkness itself. The explosion consumed the flagship, its monstrous form disintegrating in a burst of fiery energy. The shockwave rippled through the void, scattering the remnants of the Voidborn fleet and silencing their shrieks. It was a moment of pure, blinding light, a beacon of hope in a galaxy shrouded in shadow. On the bridge of the Starforge, the crew watched in silence as the flagship fell. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, their bodies trembling from the strain of the battle. But in their eyes, there was something new, something that had been absent for so long. It was hope. Captain Voss stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the fading light of the explosion. He did not speak, but his expression said everything. They had done it. Against all odds, they had struck a blow against the Voidborn, a blow that would echo across the galaxy. Below, on Dawnspire, the Illyri emerged from their crystal cities to watch the sky. Elder Lyrian stood at the edge of the volcanic field, her glowing eyes reflecting the light of the explosion. She felt the weight of the moment, the significance of what had been achieved. Humanity, broken and scattered, had stood for them. And together, they had pushed back the darkness. The void was silent now, the remnants of the Voidborn fleet drifting aimlessly. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Yet in that moment, as the light of the flagship's destruction faded, a spark of hope ignited, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, courage and unity could forge a path to victory. The silence after the battle was deafening. Where once the void had been alive with the roar of plasma fire and the unearthly shrieks of the Voidborn, now there was only stillness. The wreckage of the enemy fleet drifted aimlessly above Dawn's Spear, broken fragments of grotesque organic vessels casting long shadows over the planet below. The air seemed heavy, as if the universe itself mourned the cost of the victory. Aboard the Starforge, the crew moved like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. The ship was barely holding together, its hull riddled with fractures, its engines sputtering weakly. Sparks flickered from exposed wires, and the faint hum of life support systems was the only sound in the shattered corridors. The once proud vessel, a symbol of humanity's defiance, now seemed like a dying giant, its strength spent in the struggle. Captain Voss stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the edge of the console as he gazed out at the wreckage. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes shadowed by grief. The weight of the battle hung heavily on his shoulders, every decision, every sacrifice etched into his soul. Yet amid the sorrow, there was a flicker of relief. The Voidborn fleet was destroyed. Dawn's Spear was safe. For now. The bridge was quiet, save for the faint crackle of damaged systems. Voss's crew stood behind him, their expressions a mixture of weariness and pride. They had survived, though many of their comrades had not. The memory of those lost lingered in the air, a silent tribute to the price they had paid for this victory. Below, on the surface of Dawn's Spear, the Ilari emerged from their crystalline shelters. Their glowing forms moved cautiously at first, as if unsure whether the nightmare was truly over. The light that emanated from their bodies was soft, like the first rays of dawn after a long, dark night. They looked to the sky, where the remnants of the battle still drifted, and a sense of awe and disbelief filled their hearts. Against all odds, the humans had done what they themselves had thought impossible. The Voidborn were defeated. Elder Lyrian stood at the forefront of her people, her crystalline form shimmering in the light of the distant stars. Her face, though alien in its beauty, was filled with emotion, gratitude, sorrow, and a fragile hope that had not existed before. She turned her gaze toward the Starforge, the broken ship that had become a beacon of resistance. It was a testament to the resilience of humanity, a species she had once thought fragile and insignificant. Now, she saw them differently. They were not weak. They were unyielding. When the Starforge descended to the surface, its landing was unsteady, the ship groaning under its own weight. The crew disembarked slowly, their movements stiff and weary. They were battered, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces marked with the grime of battle. Yet they stood tall, their eyes meeting those of the Ilari with quiet determination. Voss was the last to step onto the surface. His boots crunched against the crystalline ground as he approached Elder Lyrian. The two leaders stood facing each other, their peoples watching in silence. The air between them felt heavy with unspoken words, the weight of everything they had endured together. Lyrian's voice was soft but resonant, carrying the melodic tones of her people. "You have done what we thought impossible," she said, her glowing eyes meeting Voss's. "You have faced the darkness and driven it away. You have given us a future." Her words were filled with emotion, and for a moment, the weight of them seemed to hang in the air. The Ilari had lived in fear for so long, retreating into isolation, believing that resistance was futile. Now, they stood on the edge of something new, a chance to rebuild, to hope. Voss's expression was tired but resolute. He met Lyrian's gaze, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that gripped him. Hope is worth fighting for, he said simply. Always. The words carried a quiet power, a truth that resonated deeply with everyone who heard them. The Ilari, who had long forgotten what it meant to hope, felt something stir within them. It was fragile, like the first spark of a fire, but it was there. And it was enough. Around them, the crystalline landscape of Dawnspire seemed to glow more brightly, as if the planet itself was responding to the shift in its people. The Ilari began to gather, their forms shimmering with renewed light. They looked to the humans not as saviors, but as allies, beings who had shown them that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was still a reason to stand. But the cost of victory was undeniable. The Starforge was broken, its crew diminished, and the scars of the battle would remain long after the wreckage of the Voidborn fleet had drifted into oblivion. Voss knew that this was only one battle in a much larger war. The Voidborn were not defeated entirely, they were a force that stretched across the stars, a shadow that would return. Yet for now, they had won. And that was enough. As the humans and the Ilari stood together on the surface of Dawnspire, the weight of their shared struggle bound them in a way that words could not. They had faced the void and survived. They had shown the galaxy that even in the darkest of times, unity and courage could forge a path forward. Above them, the shattered remains of the Voidborn fleet drifted into the void, silent and lifeless. The stars beyond them shone brightly, their light a reminder that even in the vast emptiness of space, there was beauty. There was hope. And so, as the Ilari began to rebuild and the humans prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, one truth remained. The cost of victory was great, but the spark it ignited was greater still. Together, they had proven that the light of hope could never truly be extinguished. The air was heavy with the weight of unspoken promises as Captain Voss stood before the gathered Ilari. Their crystalline forms shimmered faintly in the light of Dawnspire's twin suns, their colors shifting like living prisms, each movement a silent ripple of emotion. The devastation of the battle lingered around them, the ground scarred by the volcanic eruptions and the remnants of Voidborn wreckage scattered across the horizon. Yet, amidst the ruin, there was a quiet sense of renewal, a fragile hope growing like a seed in scorched earth. Voss's voice carried across the crowd, steady and resolute despite the weariness etched into his features. His uniform was torn, smeared with soot and blood, but he stood tall, his presence commanding. The humans who had survived stood behind him, their faces solemn, their silence a testament to the sacrifices they had made. The Ilari watched him closely, their glowing eyes reflecting the faint light of the stars above, their expressions unreadable yet filled with a quiet reverence. Humanity may be small, Voss began, his words deliberate, each one sinking deep into the hearts of those who listened. But we are not alone. When the galaxy calls, we will answer. Together, we are stronger than any darkness. His voice carried an undeniable power, not the kind born from authority, but from truth. It was the voice of someone who had seen the depths of despair, who had fought against impossible odds and emerged scarred but unbroken. The words resonated with the Ilari, piercing through the centuries of isolation and fear that had defined their existence. For so long, they had believed themselves alone in the face of the Voidborn's relentless terror. Now, they saw that they were not. The silence that followed was profound, as if the entire planet was holding its breath. Then, Elder Lyrian stepped forward, her crystalline form glowing brighter as she addressed her people. Her voice was soft but carried a melodic strength, each word weaving through the crowd like a thread of light. "We have witnessed bravery beyond measure," she said, her gaze shifting between Voss and the humans behind him. "Humanity has shown us that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there is strength in unity. There is strength in hope." She turned to her people, her glowing eyes meeting theirs, one by one. "We will rebuild," she promised, her voice steady and filled with conviction. Not just our cities, but our hearts. We will rise from the ashes of this battle and remember what was done here not with sorrow, but with gratitude. The story of the Starforged will be carried across the stars, a beacon to remind the galaxy that even the smallest flame can banish the greatest shadow. The Ilari murmured in agreement, their voices blending into a harmonious hum that filled the air like a song of renewal. Their glowing forms seemed to brighten, their light reflecting off the crystalline ground and casting soft rainbows into the sky. It was as if Dawn Spirit itself was responding to their vow, the planet's ancient energy stirring beneath their feet. Voss watched them, his expression unreadable. He felt the weight of their promise, the significance of what had been achieved. Humanity, scattered and fractured, had stood for something greater than themselves. And in doing so, they had sparked a fire that would burn across the galaxy, a fire of defiance, of courage, of hope. As the humans prepared to leave, the Ilari gathered to say their farewells. They approached the crew of the Starforged with quiet reverence, their crystalline hands brushing against the humans' shoulders in gestures of gratitude. Though their languages were different, their intentions were clear. The bond forged in battle was unbreakable, a connection that transcended words. Elder Lyrian approached Voss one final time, her glowing form radiating warmth. "Captain," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You have given us more than victory. You have given us purpose. For that, we are forever in your debt." Voss shook his head, his expression resolute. "There is no debt," he replied. "Only the promise that when the darkness returns, we will face it together." The words hung in the air, a quiet oath that bound their peoples in a way that neither could fully understand. The Ilari bowed their heads, their glowing forms shimmering like the first light of dawn. They would remember this day not just as the day the Voidborn were defeated, but as the day humanity stood with them, shoulder to shoulder, against the void. As the Starforged rose into the sky, its engines sputtering but determined, the Ilari watched in silence. They stood together, their glowing forms casting soft light across the scarred landscape. The story of the battle, of humanity's courage, would spread across the galaxy, carried by the Ilari's crystalline voices. It would become a legend, a reminder that even in the vast emptiness of space, unity could forge a path through the dark. And so, as the humans departed and the Ilari began to rebuild, one truth remained. The galaxy was vast, filled with shadows that threatened to consume all light. But as long as there were those who stood together, who believed in the power of hope, no darkness could ever truly prevail. The Starforged disappeared into the shimmering folds of hyperspace, leaving behind the fractured skies of Dawnspire. Its departure was not marked by fanfare or celebration, only the quiet hum of its engines fading into the void. Yet, in its wake, it left something far greater than the wreckage of the Voidborn fleet or the smoldering scars of battle. It left a story that would ripple across the galaxy like a whisper carried on the cosmic winds. The tale of the Starforged spread slowly at first, like the first flickers of a flame in the darkness. It began with the Ilari, their crystalline voices weaving the story into song, their glowing forms spreading across neighboring systems to share the truth of what had transpired. They spoke of humanity's courage, of the ship that had stood against the endless void and emerged battered but unbroken. The words carried a power of their own, igniting something long forgotten in the hearts of those who heard them, hope. For centuries, the Voidborn had been a shadow that loomed over the galaxy, a force of destruction so overwhelming that resistance seemed futile. Entire civilizations had fallen silent, their light extinguished without a trace. Worlds had turned inward, hiding behind their own walls, resigned to the inevitability of extinction. But now, the story of the Starforged shattered that silence. It was proof that the Voidborn were not invincible. They could be fought. They could be defeated. Across the galaxy, oppressed worlds began to stir. On distant planets where the Voidborn's shadow had lingered for generations, whispers of rebellion began to rise. In the dark corners of forgotten colonies, where fear had long replaced hope, people began to look to the stars with something new in their hearts. They spoke of the humans, of the crew who had stood against the darkness not for glory, but to protect the innocent. The story became a spark, lighting fires in places where the void had once consumed all. The Starforge itself became a legend. Its name was spoken with reverence, its image etched into the minds of those who dreamed of freedom. It was no longer just a ship, it was a symbol. A beacon. A reminder that even the smallest light could pierce the deepest darkness. The crew's sacrifices, their unyielding determination, became the foundation of something far greater than themselves. They had not just fought for survival, they had fought for a future. The Voidborn, once feared as an unstoppable force, now found themselves facing resistance unlike anything they had encountered before. On worlds they had once conquered with ease, they met defiance. Armies rose where there had been none, fueled by the belief that victory was possible. The Voidborn's shrieks of terror echoed across the stars as they began to realize that the galaxy itself was turning against them. For every world they sought to consume, there were now 10 more that stood ready to fight. And yet, the Starforge was just one ship. Its crew was mortal, its hull battered and scarred. It was not a fleet, nor an empire. But its legacy was far greater than its physical form. It became a story told in hushed tones and roaring declarations, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding determination to stand against the void. It was a story that reminded the galaxy of something it had almost forgotten, that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was always a reason to fight. The Ilari, once isolated and resigned to their fate, became the first to carry the story beyond their borders. Their crystalline forms glowed brighter than ever as they traveled to distant systems, their voices weaving the tale into the fabric of the stars. They spoke not just of humanity's bravery, but of the bond that had been forged between their peoples. They spoke of unity, of the strength that came from standing together. And as their words spread, the galaxy began to change. In the ruins of ancient cities and the depths of forgotten worlds, people began to rise. They looked to the stars and saw not just the vast emptiness of space, but the possibility of something greater. The story of the Starforge became a rallying cry, a reminder that even the smallest act of defiance could echo across the cosmos. It was a story that refused to fade, a light that refused to be extinguished. And so, as the Starforge continued its journey through the stars, its legacy grew. It was no longer just a ship. It was a legend. A new chapter in the galaxy's history, written in blood and fire, but also in hope. It was a reminder that no matter how vast the darkness, no matter how deep the void, there would always be those who stood against it. The galaxy would remember the Starforge. It would remember the humans who had fought not for themselves, but for all who could not. It would remember the day the Voidborn learned that even the smallest flame could burn brighter than they had ever imagined. And though the Starforge vanished into the endless expanse of hyperspace, its story would live on. A story of defiance. A story of unity. A story of hope.